Hello, everyone, and welcome to the introduction to this week's podcast. I'm just about to start my annual Lewis and Clark cultural tour. People have been coming in on planes from all over the country, and they're gathered for the moment in Great Falls. They'll be here in Fort Benton, about 40 miles away. By mid-afternoon, we'll have our orientation meeting in the early evening, a group dinner. People will be given dry bags to put in such gear as they need for the 3 days we will spend on the Missouri through the White Cliffs, the most extraordinary part of the entire Missouri River system. Then we'll come back and shower and have an evening on the deck with wonderful musicians, good friends of mine, and then off to the Bitterroot Mountains to hike for 3 days, camp 2 nights up on the Low Trail. It's such a joy to talk about all of this with Russ Eagle. He's been my dear friend for many years. He came on this trip as a client, as a paid guest. Fell in love with this journey. This great cultural tour, has been here many times now, and now he and his wonderful wife, Liz, Liz of the gumbo haughtiness, but leaving that aside, they're our camp hosts, and they're wonderful friends and great at all that they do. So we're about to embark. This will be my 24th or 25th time on the White Cliff section of the Missouri. It never gets old. But Russ and I needed and wanted to produce a podcast before we embark, not only because we may not survive, but because this is a really interesting topic. And Russ said he wanted to talk about rivers. He knows my fascination with rivers. I collect small bottles of water from the sources of rivers. I love the idea of a river source, even though it's a little bit unscientific now that we know that there is no single source of any river really, but a series of braided creeks and rivulets. Russ and I talk about Lewis and rivers. Lewis was a Missouri River man, not so much a Columbia man. I think he found the Columbia perplexing, even disappointing. But when he got to the source of the Missouri River on August 12th, 1805, he said, "Thus far, I had accomplished one of those grand objects upon which my mind has been unalterably fixed for many years." So he was, in some sense, one of the great legion of people looking for the sources of the great rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Amazon, and of course, the mother lode, the Nile, during the 19th century. So I can't wait to get out there. It's been a long summer of amazing experiences, and it's only about half done. And once we complete this, I will go to those 2 sources to do some video and some photography and some writing, and then on across the Bitterroots and into the Locksaw, Clearwater, Snake, and Columbia basins, arriving at Fort Clatsop out on the Pacific Ocean around August 12th, and then turning back to resume the journey along the Yellowstone and the Marias as I make my way back to North Dakota at the end of this summer's Lewis and Clark cross-country recreation tour. I'm having the time of my life. I'm so glad you're aboard. We'll see you down the trail. Join our friends group at the highest level you can that supports the things that we're doing. Come to the Steinbeck cultural tour, September 21st through 29th in Salinas and Monterey. Sign up for the Lewis and Clark Summer Book Club, which is underway, but there are tapes so you can catch up. We've only had one sort of orientation meeting. Sign up for our weekly free newsletter and tell all your friends and spread the good news. We're trying to come to terms with this extraordinary nation as we approach our 250th birthday. So we'll see you down the road. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. This is Russ Eagle. I'm your guest host this week, and I'm sitting here with Clay on the Lewis and Clark Trail overlooking the Missouri River in Fort Benton, Montana. Good to see you, Clay.
Yes, you too, Russ. We're in the Grand Union Hotel, a historic hotel that has been beautifully refashioned, and I'm in room 202, a junior suite, looking out on a bridge over the Missouri River. The river looks placid. It's a partly cloudy day. It'll probably get up into the 80s today, and tomorrow morning, first thing, a group of about 24 of us will embark on a 3-day, 2-night canoe trip through the White Cliffs section of the Missouri River. Some people believe it's the most beautiful section of the 2,500-mile Missouri.
And I've done it a number of times, so I cannot argue with that claim. But I wanted to ask you a few questions, Clay, about you personally in rivers. When people come on this trip, the first thing they'll see whenever we stop, whenever we get out of the boat, you just go marching right into the river. I've been on a number of these public and private river trips with you, and you really have a thing with rivers.
I do, actually, from a lot of different perspectives. Let me start with just the explanation. So we get in the canoes, and everyone is a little tentative. It's a big river. It's a powerful looking river. They don't know how deep it is, and it's muddy. It's not a purling mountain stream. You can't see the bottom of it. And at first people are like, I don't know if I want to get in that river. So the minute we stop for the first morning break, I go right in. And then people see, oh, okay, I'm not going to drown probably. I can stand up. And then you've watched it, haven't you? When first one or two will come in, and then within a few hours, almost everybody gets in the water.
But, I've also seen you alone, in the Little Missouri River, just sitting in the middle of the river reading a book.
Yes, so rivers really matter to me. I grew up on the Little Missouri River, and I've sort of adopted it as my own place. It starts at Devil's Tower in Wyoming, winds up through the western just edge of the Black Hills, and starts to cut Badlands when it enters North Dakota. And I was introduced to it by a mentor a long time ago. I've spent a lot of time hiking it. I've walked the entire distance of it twice, about 250 miles worth. My daughter was baptized in the river, much to her mother's chagrin, but she survived. And so it matters. So that's one thing, is that I've had this kind of relationship with the Little Missouri River. And of course, you're not going to drown in the Little Missouri unless you pass out first. But I also am interested in rivers generally. Where does the water come from? Why does it just keep coming? It never ends, even in October. Where does it go? One of the things I ask myself, Russ, is if you could identify with a die a cubic inch of water and follow it, where would it go? Would it go all the way to mouth of the Missouri at St. Louis? Would it go to New Orleans? And does any drop of water this far up ever reach the sea, or is there a continuous evaporation and precipitation and so on? I'm fascinated by this. Rivers are perplexing in many respects, and there's some sort of a mystery about them that I find really compelling. And as you know, I usually at this point would say, remember the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, who said you can never walk into the same river twice, that you can never enter the same river twice. You are different, and it is different. And so rivers, in my view, automatically inspire reflection. And I love to sit along them. The other day, I was at the Three Forks, the Gallatin, the Madison, and the Jefferson, which form the Missouri. And I sat in the Gallatin River for about an hour and a half and just mused. I won't say meditated, but reflected, mused, enjoyed the perfect temperature of the water. But you think, how exactly do they operate? And I've been looking for a book that will explain river hydrology in a way that I can understand. And that's the rub, because of course there are people who know rivers, but the terminology gets so dense that I can't really follow it.
One of the neat things about this trip that we're on now too, you talk about the Missouri and it's muddy and not necessarily inviting to the
at first glance.
Then later on we move over the divide, and we spend time in the Lochsaw River, which is just as crystal clear and cool and inviting as any river you will ever see, especially at this time of year.
Yes, so there's a very different river. The Missouri is clear near its source, but we are a long way from there at Fort Benton. By the way, Fort Benton is the historic head of navigation. Steamboats could go this far up the river, and then they had to turn back. And so Fort Benton is a historically important port. When we go across to the other side, to the Pacific side, we get onto the Lochsaw River, also important to Lewis and Clark. Again, people are a little squeamish because it looks cold. It looks really cold, and the rocks look slippery, and you think, I could drown in this river. But we take our camp chairs, our lawn chairs down, and we find a kind of a stable enough place. And first 2 or 3 people are out there. This is on the last day of our journey when we have nothing else that we have to do. And pretty soon there are 10 or 15 people sitting out there. And some people bring sodas and beer. And it turns out to be one of the real highlights of the journey. And so people are getting a Plains River in the Missouri, and they're getting a sort of a classical mountain stream in the Lochsaw. And in fact, if you close your eyes, whoever's listening, and think of what would a beautiful mountain stream that's about 25 yards wide look like, that's what it looks like, isn't it?
It is. And of course, also on our January trips, we get to spend time in winter with the Lochsaw River, and you can, sometimes it's covered in snow and ice, but you can still hear that water trickling through the rocks underneath. Stunning river, and it feeds into what? The
Lochsaw feeds the Clearwater feeds the Snake feeds the Columbia empties at Astoria into the Pacific Ocean.
And if it were navigable, then Lewis and Clark could have just jumped in the Lochsaw and skipped the whole Lolo Trail, Wendover hike. And
they found out to their cost that there was no easy passage between the headwaters of the Missouri and the headwaters of the Columbia system. They had been kind of led to believe it might be a half-day's portage, and there would be a navigable river really close to the mountain ridge that divided them, the Continental Divide. And Lewis later wrote to Jefferson after they got back and said, it's 340 miles really between navigable waters of the Missouri and navigable waters of the Columbia. And he said 140 of them are through very rugged mountains, and some of them are covered with what he called eternal snow. So the ancient dream of a Northwest Passage sort of dies with that reconnaissance. Just to back up for a minute, so when they get to the source of the Missouri, or what Lewis thought was the source of the Missouri, they were hoping that the creek on the other side would be their river. It's the Salmon, and they were told by the Shoshone, who were their hosts, you can't float you're not going to float the Salmon. It's the river of no return, and it's hemmed in tightly on both sides by mountains, and so you can't even find a path along the river. So that at that point, they had to improvise, and they hired a Shoshone man they called Old Toby to take them north until they could find a place through, and they finally got to the Lochsaw, but it wasn't navigable either. And so they had to go all the way to what we call Weippe Prairie in Idaho before the Clearwater was deep enough and smooth enough to allow further passage.
And of course, Jefferson told them to find the source of the Missouri.
That's a really important question, Russ. And as you know, because I'm doing this trip, I'm following the Lewis and Clark Trail. I've been rereading the journals really, really closely, like as if I'd never read them before. And I've been reading about this. So when Lewis gets to the source of the Missouri on the 12th of August, 1805, what he takes to be the source, he says, "Thus far I had accomplished one of those grand objects upon which my mind has been unalterably fixed for many years." And when I read that the other day, I said, what? Wait a minute. I've gone over that passage a zillion times, quoted it. Why does he say, thus far I had accomplished? I mean, it sounds, doesn't it, like the Missouri River source was his goal. It's Jefferson's goal to a certain degree, but Jefferson was not like, you find the exact source. His was like, find the water route across the continent. So why is Lewis telling the truth? Is this some sort of a conventional trope, thus far I'd accomplished? I think that Lewis was one of those 19th century men, he's early, who looked for sources of rivers. And when he got to the source of the Missouri, he said, I have triumphed. And as you know, he soon stopped writing his journal.
Right.
And when he gets to the Pacific in November, which was the goal, he writes nothing. So they're stuck at this place called Dismal Niche, and it's really awful weather, and they're rolling logs, and the river, it's just a horrible situation. It's a nightmare. You can't tell land from water, from air. He goes around finally and gets to the mouth of the Columbia on the Pacific shore on the Washington side, and he writes nothing. And so you would have expected then, wouldn't you? Thus far I had accomplished one of those great... He's the first American to cross the continent, and he doesn't write about it at all. But when he gets to the source of the Missouri, he writes this grandiloquent, triumphant passage. So that has to be important. And I'm looking at it in a new way. So not only is Heraclitus right that you can never enter the same river twice, but in some sense you can never enter the same historical story twice because you notice new things.
Which I know is a lot of what you and David Nicandri have written about. Just further evidence that, each time you read through, if you take the time and are careful enough, new things pop out.
I've been writing this thing called Lewis and Clark Short Bites. I've sent you just a little sample of it. I'm now up to more than 115. And they're between 50 words and 300 words. They're just short. And every time I come upon something, I think, oh my, did I know that? Or have I never seen that? Have I forgotten it? Or is it just is it striking me in a new way? And then I write a little bit about it. It's an astonishing project. And you're a Steinbeck guy. If you read, East of Eden again with that in mind, I'm sure you would have like 30, 40, 50 short bites where you just say, oh, well, that's interesting.
Right, and sometimes you react with joy, and sometimes you sort of kick yourself.
Yeah, well, what an ignoramus am I? I regard myself as a Lewis and Clark expert, and yet I've discovered on this not half-year-long journey how little I really know, and it's humbling. It's also aspirational because I think there's still time.
All right, Clay, well, I think we need to take a break here, but I know you've been on some of these rivers in the recent weeks, so maybe when we come back, we can talk about what you've been up to. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle. I'm sitting here in Fort Benton, Montana with Clay on the Missouri River. We're going to be getting in canoes tomorrow and headed downriver.
14, what 12 or 14 the first day, right?
Yes, I think it's about 14 the first day.
To Eagle Camp, which is a Lewis and Clark historic camp.
And just a stunningly beautiful place to spend an evening.
So we stop at Eagle Camp the first night, they camp there, and then we stop at Slaughter Camp the second night. It sounds awful, but it's a magnificent site. So those 2 nights on the river, but we're actually exactly where they camped in 1805 and 1806.
And I believe Slaughter Camp is just one camp upriver from the campsite where the bison ran through camp.
Yes.
That night, which is
and the dog barked it away,
right.
And so on. But Lewis writes very dramatically about this, that the hoof prints were just a few inches from the heads of the sleeping men, and this could easily have been a disaster. But the dog, his Newfoundland named Seaman, which he bought for $20 back in Pittsburgh, almost on a whim, the dog proved to be a really important player in the Lewis and Clark world, gets mentioned more than many of the men. And in this case, the dog barked enough that the bull buffalo veered its course.
And I think I've heard you say that you get a lot of questions about the dog.
The number one question asked by young people is, tell me what happened to the dog, what happened to the dog? We don't know. The dog disappears from the journals on July 15th, 1806, last mention. And the last mention is it was just howling all night because the mosquitoes were so awful that it was just tormenting it. I'm sure the dog lived through that. Lewis soon goes on a reconnaissance mission up on the Marias, up near Glacier National Park. He wouldn't have taken the dog on that, I don't think, because they were moving fast. The dog probably had to stay back with the boats, but the dog ceases to get written about. That doesn't mean that the dog didn't survive the journey, but it never got mentioned again. It got to be a pretty crazy time after that incident up on the Marias River. So young people ask about the dog. When I portray Lewis, as I don't really do anymore because I'm now precisely twice as old as he was when he died, the children will say, "What happened to the dog, Captain Lewis?" And I have no answer. What can you say? You can't lie. So you say, well, the last time we wrote about it was on July 15th, 1806, which would satisfy an adult, but a child will say, yeah, but what happened to it? And there's no answer.
This trip you're on now, this year, you're retracing the Lewis and Clark route. This is connected for most of the way to rivers, and you're in a pickup truck with an Airstream.
A paradox.
Right. So So how do you overcome that? How are you experiencing the rivers?
Well, last year, as you know, I followed Steinbeck's 1960 Travels with Charlie tour, and he had a truck camper, and so that's easy. You just find the road and you get as close to it as you can. And he wasn't particularly interested in rivers, although he said the Missouri was the line of demarcation between the American East and the American West at Bismarck and Mandan in today's North Dakota. But this year, I'm following Lewis and Clark, and almost all of it was a river journey in a flotilla of boats, sometimes big boats and later small canoes that they hacked out of trees out here in the West. So I thought, well, how can that really be a good recreation of the Lewis and Clark travels if I'm pulling an Airstream everywhere? So the question is, how close can you get on the roads to the river? And it turns out that's not easy. But I decided, Russ, as you know, to add in some river adventures. And so the first one was a couple of weeks ago, south of Bismarck on the Missouri, with two young men, Nolan, my friend and videographer, and his friend, Brian Jackson. And we used a loaner pontoon boat to go about 50 some miles up the river from Fort Rice in North Dakota to Bismarck. So we were on the river for 3 days, and it was magnificent, and learned a lot about Lewis and Clark by doing it. And fulfilled the Lewis and Clark mission by doing it. We can come back to that. So then I was in Bismarck. I knew I was coming on this trip where we start tomorrow to canoe for 3 days. And I've done this every year now for almost a quarter of a century, and never gets old. I do sometimes kind of long for the first year or two when it was brand new and it was just like filled with wonder. And now it's not that it doesn't any longer arouse feelings of wonder, but we kind of know what's around the next bend. So that trip I knew was coming. So last week, I wanted to float the Yellowstone because, as you know, on the way back, they split up at near today's Missoula, and Clark bushwhacked over to the Yellowstone and then went down the Yellowstone with a catamaran, and he was with Sacagawea and Charbonneau and the infant, Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and York, and about half of the men. And they almost had like a luxury float trip. It was so wonderful. No incidents. Well, there was some horse stealing, but they didn't seem to mind. Meanwhile, Lewis is having this incredibly difficult time up on the Marias, which culminates on August 11th near Williston, North Dakota, when he's accidentally shot in the buttocks by one of his own men. So Lewis is having a rough return. Clark's having a lark, a holiday, a vacation. But I wanted to get on the Yellowstone when it was a new river. So my friend Wayne Fairchild, my outfitter, our dear friend, I called him and said, Wayne, do you know anybody down there that might, I could do a one-day float trip? He said, oh, I'm on it. And so the next day he called and said, yeah, this guy Josh is wanting to do this. So about 5 of us, including my daughter and her fiancé, Simon, got on a raft at Gardner, Montana, which was the old gateway into Yellowstone National Park, and floated for a whole day. And we had class 2 and even class 3 rapids, even something that approached class 4. And it was absolutely magical. So that's not the Yellowstone I know. That's not the Yellowstone you know. The Yellowstone we know is that long river that you see when you drive along I-90 and I-94 from North Dakota to western Montana. It's a magnificent plains river, but it's not clear, and it's not a mountain stream. So I wanted that experience. So I had that, and now I'll jump forward. In a few weeks, you and I will meet again, and your mate Liz, and we will be with a small group of people for a second Missouri float from the Judith River mouth, Judith Landing, to James Kip, which is a 4-day canoe trip in more primitive conditions. It's not glamping by any means, and I've never done it, always wanted to. Wayne has always said we must. Now we're doing it, and I'm so glad that you're part of it, and a few of our friends who really have been longing for that section of the river. So the last thing I'll say about this is I intend to get on the Columbia near Astoria, and there are excursion boats that I think I can hire one. And my goal, I don't know if I'll be able to achieve this, Russ, my goal is to get out to the bar where the river meets the sea. And as you know, the Columbia Bar has been the graveyard of ships, boats, yachts, etc. I've done it once before. You have to have a very, very, very clear day and a good boat.
I would be Marlon Perkins if you did that. I would be hovering above in the helicopter.
Clay is down there. Yes, you would be hovering and without a guide rope to lower to me. But I don't know if that'll get done, but I certainly will get on the lower Columbia. I've done that before. And so my goal, in short, is to make sure that a river journey recreation actually involves some rivers.
And you were talking about the return trip when Clark was on the Yellowstone, Lewis was on the Marias. To me, that may be the most fascinating, most interesting part, and I think one of the best places, if you're not familiar with it, one of the best accounts of this is in your Lewis book, where you sort of follow them down, and it gets quite comical from 200 years perspective. I'm sure it was not. Lewis was really getting frustrated.
First of all, let me just quickly explain that they went all the way out to the Pacific, and while they were at the Pacific, Clark finished his master map, I believe it was February 14th, 1806, at Fort Clatsop. And then they realized there were some things they still wanted to do. They still needed a recon of the Yellowstone, so Clark would do that. Lewis wanted to find a northern tributary of the Missouri, because if he did, it could drive back the Canadian border, and he thought that was Jefferson's great desire. And so Lewis kept trying to figure out what is the northernmost tributary, and he finally selected the Marias, which he had named for a cousin of his back in June of 1805. And so he took just 3 men, and he went up to see where its source was. And on July 22nd, 1806, he realized, oh, it's not going to have a Canadian source. He lingered to get latitude and longitude because he really needed that data. And that was almost a fatal mistake. So they finally gave up on July 26th, and he's heading back down to the mouth of the Marias to meet the rest of his contingent. And they run into 8 young Blackfeet men. And Lewis figures, you've been there, Russ, you can describe it. I mean, you don't run away. There's no place to hide. So he decides that he's going to have to meet these young men.
Right. When in the account, I can't remember how many miles, maybe over 100 miles, Lewis just pushed the men and the horses. And when you're reading the account, you think this is a little melodramatic, but when you go there, when you stand up there at that monument and look the route they had to take, it's perfectly understandable. You can see forever. There's no way you would ever, if somebody were pursuing you, you would ever feel safe.
And so what happened is before Lewis has 3 men, 3 of his best, and these 8 young Blackfeet, they're probably adolescents. They just want to snatch up these rifles and horses. It's a coup attempt. They're not trying to really harm Lewis and his men, but at dawn, they snatch what they can. And suddenly Lewis wakes up and it's a melee and his rifle's missing, and he takes out his pistol. And so Reubenfield, one of his best men, winds up stabbing one of the 8 young Blackfeet with a knife and kills him almost instantly. And Lewis is trying to prevent another pair from absconding with their horses, which would be a really bad situation to be up there without horses. And Lewis winds up shooting another one of the men in the gut. He may have survived, and there's some competing oral traditions about that. So now they burn all the stuff that they can, the bows and arrows and the shields and stuff, and they put a piece metal on the chest of the one that Reubenfield killed, a strange and idiotic thing to do, like leaving a calling card. And then Lewis says, let's get the hell out of here. I mean, we got to move. And he gives this heroic speech to the men. If I know you're tired and you want to rest and you can barely stand up, but our survival and the survival of the rest of our crew may depend upon this. And so they go more than 100 miles in 24 hours. And at one point they stop, and when they get off their horses, they fall. They can hardly stand. But Lewis is afraid that there will be a reprisal party, and that makes perfect good sense. But as you say, when you're up there and you see the bald landscape, I mean, there are almost no trees in any direction until you reach what's called the backbone of the Rocky Mountains, and you can see forever. And when you told me, just look around, just look around, and where would you hide? And you realize what a stark landscape that is. So Lewis is not being a drama king when he talks this way.
That's always been my contention, because I read the journals before I was on the trail, and it changes your entire perspective.
Isn't that amazing? Like you think you know something, and then you go out there and think, oh, now I understand it. Now I understand it.
And just finishing this story, because I guess that was sort of the dark side of it, but then it starts to get comical. Mosquitoes played a big role in this sort of chase scene down the river.
So first of all, they wind up killing at least 1 and maybe 2 of these Blackfeet. And this is the only bloodshed of the expedition. And Lewis was really upset about it because Jefferson had made such a big deal out of peace and conciliation and don't get yourself into any trouble. And Lewis had kind of a reputation as a hothead. So now he's killed at least one and probably two. He's left a calling card on one of them. They get the heck out of there on these horses, and they get back down to the mouth of the Marias. And like by one of the greatest coincidences of the entire story, the men are waiting right there. They're like coming around a bend in the river in their boats. Lewis and his three men get there. They jump off. They're breathless. They try to tell the tale, and they said, "Get in the boats, move." And so they go downstream, and now Lewis thinks they're following us. They're following us. They're following us. And about 10 days later, near Yellowstone, North Dakota, he's accidentally shot in the buttocks by his own man, mistaken for an elk. He's wearing elk skins, but he thinks it's the reprisal. And so he goes into this whole heroic thing where he says, I was staggering and could barely move, but I decided I would sell my life as dearly as possible, that whole kind of heroic thing. And it turns out it was just his own man, Pierre Cruzat, who was nearly blind and mistook him for an elk. So comical to us, not comical to Meriwether Lewis. I think this is a place where I think I am the actual pioneer scholar, because I've really focused on that thing. What would it be like to be the commander of this extraordinary mission, and then when you're almost home, be shot in the ass?
Right.
And then not to get into grim detail, but there's no surgery here. It didn't strike a bone or artery, but it left a huge hole and a groove an inch deep in one of his buttocks cheeks. And that, according to the medicine of the time, as you know, Russ, they had to keep that open so it would suppurate. It just sounds awful. And Lewis has to lie on his tummy over a barrel in the boat as he's coming down to his triumphant return to St. Louis. And just things like, I think a lot of disappointment sets in on the return journey, that they did not find the northern tributary. He did not even get the latitude and longitude of the place where the Marias peaks out. He did not, Clark on the Yellowstone did not make contact with the Crow that they wanted. Clark even wrote a speech for the Crow, and they never made contact. All the Crow stole their horses. Then they're supposed to meet sometime in the fall, and Clark gets there first and says, the mosquitoes are just so awful, I'm moving on. And when Lewis gets there, he kind of freaks out because Clark has moved on. There's kind of a way in which there's a disintegration, but a kind of semi-comic disintegration from our point of view as you look at it. Meanwhile, Clark is just like whistling Dixie, having a great time floating the Yellowstone. And I'm sure he wondered, Russ, what is it about Lewis? What is it about Lewis that, like, bad things seem to cluster around him when he's alone out there? Because Clark was so even-tempered and so steady, and I think he steadied Lewis, but they had been separated for this last recon, and things went really badly for poor Mr. Lewis. And in some sense, I don't think getting back to St. Louis was triumphant for him.
There are a number of people who contend that I think Lewis was sort of unraveling on the entire return trip.
McAndry and Slaughter and Jenkinson, they're called. David McAndry, one of my good friends. He said in his book, River of Promise, Lewis and Clark on the Columbia, that Lewis was having a slow motion nervous breakdown on the return journey. I agree more or less, although that's a pretty strong term. And Thomas Slaughter says that he was already spiritually dead. And so we are singled out as the three revisionists, I suppose they would call it. And I just have edited an article for We Proceeded On of a person denouncing us yet again, as we don't understand, we'd like to emphasize the negative, that there's no evidence of a nervous breakdown, and so on and so forth. So Thomas Slaughter, David McAndry, and I are the ones that posit that things really fell apart. And the evidence, I think you will agree, seems to point that way. But there's such a mythology of success and triumph and best friendship in American history between Lewis and Clark, and they never had a bad day. And that mythology, as you know, runs really, really, really deep in the Lewis and Clark world, including to the point that people refuse to believe that he committed suicide 3 years after they returned.
And you've been a part of that debate over decades, and
I lose every time. So, you win on points and lose on audience response. We had this meeting at the end of the bicentennial in which there were 400 people there, and we had the best experts from every direction talk about this all day. And it was clear to any rational being that Lewis committed suicide, since there's no evidence whatsoever that he was murdered. And at the end, I called for a vote, and it was like 90-1 that he was murdered. Just people, no, we will not accept that view. And people say to me, to this day, Lewis is the kind of man who would never commit suicide. And I think, have you ever really looked into the psychology of suicide? Because you can't really predict.
Right. All right, we need to take a break. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back, everyone. It's Clay. I'm with my good dear friend Russ Eagle. We're in a hotel, the Grand Union Hotel in Fort Benton, Montana. Our group will be gathering today. Russ is in charge of making sure the logistics all mesh and everyone gets to this hotel for dinner and our orientation meeting. I'm looking out on the river, Russ. I can't wait for tomorrow. It's always a little crazy in the morning when we start because people are nervous and they all have new gear and they don't know what to pack and what to leave behind. And there's a lot of like that last second anxiety, I would say. And then when we get to the river, everyone is worried about bathrooms and changing into their river clothes and putting on and so on. But then once we get out, you and I usually get out a little ahead of the pack, even just 100 yards. And suddenly things start to go quiet, and you and I have a long enough established friendship that we can go 5-6 hours without saying a word, just slowly working our way down the river. Maybe see the eagle? Yeah. And then quiet for another hour. You see that bighorn sheep? Yeah, I think that's a bighorn sheep. All right. And then another hour of quiet, whereas a lot of the rest of the crew are like talking about old episodes of Three's Company and Andy of Maybury and housing projects and their sons and daughters who are about to get married or about to get divorced. It takes a while, doesn't it, for people to work out their chatter?
It does, but they eventually do, and I think that's one of the appealing things about this trip. When we're on the river, and when we're hiking in the mountains, it's day-long stuff. You separate out, you find your own space. You can hike alone, you can hike with a small group. You can do about whatever you want. We have outstanding guides. As confidence builds, people start to get a little cocky about things. I know when we start talking about what we how we might succeed on the Lewis and Clark expedition, which of course is we would make it halfway through the first day.
You know what I do on day 2 when after Eagle Camp, we get out there and there's a special place I want people to see because we're actually in a painting by Karl Bodmer, the Swiss painter who was with Prince Maximilian in 1833. And one of his most famous paintings is of the White Cliffs, the gates of the Missouri and the White Cliffs. And so I ask everyone to turn around and look at them. And I'm actually more somehow impressed by that than many of our guests. But I also say, paddle upriver for a minute or two. Just paddle against the current for a minute or two. And then you hear these groans like, no way, no effing way, I know, how could they have done it? And people realize, oh, we're floating with the current, which is 5 miles an hour or 4 miles an hour. We have to paddle, but we, unless there are high winds, we're going to get to camp. And these people are like, oh, this couldn't have been so bad. And then you think, well, just turn around for 5 minutes. And then they realize what Lewis and Clark were up against.
And with all the dams now, of course, the flow that they're going against is nothing like.
Exactly. Snags. That's what I learned on the pontoon trip. So I went on this pontoon trip with Nolan and his friend Brian Jackson on this pontoon, which feels a little bougie, if I may use my daughter's term for it, but it was great. But what we discovered is that there are logs just below the surface, and you got to avoid them. They'll break your boat. There are sawyers, these trees that are kind of rooted in the bottom, and they kind of saw up and down with the waves. The banks fall in. There are hidden sandbars. There are false channels. We went up a false channel for a couple of miles and realized then we had to turn back. Well, that's easy for us with an outboard motor, 175 horsepower. Try that when you've got 30 men working at the top of their physical bent. These are like Navy SEALs or Olympians, people who do extreme triathlons and so on. His crew, they had the right stuff. We don't. And so I learned a lot about the river by being on that pontoon going against the current. And so there's, again, going back to what we said in the first segment, you think you know something, but when you get out there into the field, you see in a new way, and connections come, and there's a deepening of your understanding. You've got to do both. You've got to have the book side of it, to know what you're talking about, to know what you're looking at, to know what they said when they were there. But you also need to have an experiential response to that same set of historical moments, and that's the reason to do this. And as you know, the summer Lewis and Clark trip is our signature cultural tour. It overfills. People wait years to do it. It changes people's lives, and people just find a way to let themselves surrender into the experience they might not be able to do if we were in a power boat.
I bring this up a lot. Years ago in a book, you wrote about I think it was the 4 states of adjustment to being in the wilderness consciousness, yes. And you see people move up that scale.
Yeah, so scale 1 is like you okay, I'm enjoying this, but I can't wait to get a shower and a Big Mac. That's most of us. That's 1 or 2 days. Then level 2 is when you really start to get into it, and your digestion settles down. You know how to sleep. You know it's that you've got bathroom duties that are not pleasant, and so on, and you really get into it. Level 3 is when you think, I could really do this. I'm really my soul is awakening here. I'm bright. All the crap on insurance and fights you've had with people and deadlines and things you need to take care of and things you wish you had done and so on, all that kind of drifts out of you, and then you get into it in a kind of a really deep way, and you think, I could do this for a while. And then stage 4 is when you think, I don't ever really want to go back. I don't want to go back to civilization. And then in stage 4, it's like I've had one kind of spiritual, mystical experience in stage 4, just one. And then I thought at that point I could walk to the North Pole. I'm in tune. I'm in my body again. I'm integrated. And then you lament having to go back to a world of television advertising and people honking in parking lots because you took their spot or whatever. And there's a sort of a sorrow in having to go back. We don't get to that point. We get to level 1 for most, and maybe level 2 for some, and glimpses of level 3. But I live for that, and you can't make it happen. You have to just surrender.
I think what's interesting, as you know, one of my duties, as soon as everybody gets here, I take a group picture every year. And at the end of the trip, we give everybody a copy of that. And most of them, when did we take this? I don't even remember this. It was just 10 days earlier. When we're on the river, we stay in 2 actual Lewis and Clark campgrounds. When we're in the mountains, we do the same. We visit a few others. And I think, again, going back to my initial foray into this world, you sort of wonder about the authenticity of that. But if you get up here and you read the journals and you look at Clark's maps, I mean, they did such an amazing job. You're right there.
You know exactly where you are. And so we do 4 campsites, 2 in the mountains and 2 on the river, and they're all 4 authenticated Lewis and Clark camps. That adds a lot to people's joy. And on the Wendover Death March, which we do in the Bitterroot Mountains, we know that we are precisely where they were because there's a spring halfway up. We stop there for lunch. There's no question. And we also know that we're right there because no rational being would take that hike, right? Because Lewis was a hothead and said, we're going straight up. And it is rough, but it is one of the more satisfying experiences because everyone makes it. And then when you get around the fire that night, people are like, well, I've really done something important here. And you think, okay, you did it on a July day when somebody else carried the gear in vans, and all you had to carry was water and a power bar, and it wasn't snowing as it was when Lewis and Clark came through, and you're not taking a bunch of recalcitrant horses with the gear tied onto their backs. So I think Clark said on September 16th, 1805. I've never been as cold and wet in every part as I am at this moment. Well, none of us experiences that, and yet it's still rough. So I try to imagine what it would be like for Lewis and Clark. I don't think you can. I don't think we can understand that.
All right, you said you had some things you needed to get off your chest.
Yeah, so I just want to show you Exhibit A here, Russ. What would you call this 4-inch piece of stick?
It looks like maybe a crude knife.
Bingo. This is what might be called a spork, because Nolan and Brian, these two strapping young men who claim to be great, lake and river people, didn't bring utensils. So we're out there. I knew they were frauds. So I brought beautiful steaks from Costco. I brought potatoes to fry. I bought hamburger and hamburger buns and cheese. Because I knew that whatever they thought they were doing, they didn't know, because Brian said he would catch fish all the way. I thought, oh yeah, sure. First of all, I don't want to eat walleye for 3 days. But second of all, I doubted that he'd catch them. He said he was a spear fisher, and I think, oh, right, yeah, of course you're a spear fisher. So we get out there, and we're in this really awful campsite that they chose. It's soggy, and our feet are sinking into the sand. And so we set up our tents, and then they said, oh no, we forgot to bring utensils. So Brian says, I'll take care of this. And he takes out a knife and he whittles this thing. That is not even a good whittled spork. So I'm keeping mine. I'm going to bronze mine. And then he wouldn't start a fire with like the way you start a fire with matches and so on. He said, oh no, I'm going to do it the old-fashioned way. So we would have died like in a Jack London story had we depended upon his fire-making capacities. So these two frauds, they're great guys, but they're young. And I tell you, Russ, you've seen this on our trips. They spent the entire time holding their cell phones, trying, because we got some signals out there. Oh no, look what, I just called my wife. I'm just going to check in. I want to check my stock portfolio. I want to see about the numbers of how many people have come to the website, LT America, and so on. I had brought all these maps. You've seen them. I brought the 1895 Missouri River Commission maps that are just magnificent. They're about 30 inches wide and 12 inches or 14 inches high. And I brought Martin Plamondon's 3 volumes of the river maps that are loose leaf. And then I brought the Atlas of Gary Moulton, Volume 1. And I brought a modern gazetteer of the river and so on. So I had all these maps, and I showed them to them, and it's just like, yeah, okay. And they rolled their eyes, and they went onto this device, and Brian had something called OnX, which I recommend, by the way. It is like the greatest website. It tells you where you are on the river. It tells you what you're seeing. It tells you who owns the property alongside the river, where you can camp and where you can't camp, the temperature, the flow from the dams. And so they spent their whole time on their devices, and I realized this is really a kind of a generational thing, isn't it? Because I was kind of at first offended that they were using these devices. Like, come on. But this is how they see the world. And actually, it's a much, much better set of data than I could ever provide. But it still had bothered me. And so, but they were like young and didn't, they rolled their eyes whenever I would try to say something about Lewis and Clark. And so we had a great time in a pontoon up the river. Nolan's dad is a saint. He met us and brought gear and so on. But if these two, I couldn't survive a day on the Lewis and Clark Trail. These two wouldn't even get interviewed. These two, yeah, all I can say is it was great because they provided so much comedy. But if at one point Brian waded about half a mile down to some real fishermen and tried to buy walleye from them, we could see him trying to put one on his hook, but we saw through that. It was great. And we're going to do it again on another portion of the river, but believe me, I'm not bringing my spork. I've still got splinters at the back of my mouth. Yeah, thank you, boys. And then we'll see where you and Liz are, but I'm going to the 2 sources. I have to. So there are many more than 2 sources, but the source that Lewis found, Lemhi Pass, which he got to on the 12th of August, 1805, and then you and I have been to the other one once. I've been twice, but it's Upper Red Rock Lakes and Hell Roaring Creek.
Hell Roaring Creek. It's a great climb up, over the divide, and it's just, if you're thinking of going into the Lewis and Clark world, I think that's a must.
So what are the must places? So okay, so I've been really thinking about this as we wind down this conversation. That's one, and it's easy to get to. It get yourself to Dillon, Montana. You don't even need four-wheel drive, although it helps. You get to Lemhi Pass. That's one. Name another.
Well, I think the forts have to be there.
The Three Forks.
Yes.
And I climbed Fort Hill. There's a hill that you climb that Lewis and Clark climbed, and you really do get a panorama. So that's easy. That's right off Interstate 90 in Three Forks, Montana. The White Cliffs, of course.
The White Cliffs.
Can't get there in a vehicle.
The Lolo Trail.
You
can get there in a vehicle, but it's a rough ride.
It's easier to walk up the Wendover
much easier.
Because the roads are just so bad, so broken. They're filled with boulders, not just rocks, but boulders, and there's no way to smooth them out short of dynamite. So there's that. So that's an important place. Also the fight site up near the Marias, which
is another one you've got to work to get there, though.
You got to work to get there. There's some places you can drive to. Of course, you go to Astoria, Fort Clatsop, the Lewis and Clark Interpretive Center at Great Falls is one of the very best. There's Fort Mandan in North Dakota. There's Camp Wood, although it's been abandoned, down at the mouth of the Missouri. So there are those places that are easy to get to. Pompey's Pillar, which is near Billings, and it's a national monument now, and where Clark, on the return journey, carved his name, and so have other people, but it's now protected by plexiglass, and it's a prominent sort of sandstone outlier in the hills surrounding the Yellowstone there. So there are these places that you kind of have to go. And I've had the great joy of being able to go to most of them. There's one more, and this is maybe the last time you'll ever see me, because when we finish all this, I'm going to cross the Missouri River on foot at Twin Bridges, because when he got to what's now Twin Bridges, Montana, he says in the journal, "Today I walked across the Missouri River for the first time." Think of that. They've been at it since May 14th, 1804. It's now July 1805 or early August. They've been at it now for well more than a year. And Lewis says, today, for the first time, I was able to walk across the Missouri River. And I'm going to do that with a life jacket on. I think I can do it. I went by it a year or so ago, and I thought, yeah, I could probably do that. The current is a little swift, so you have to be careful, but I want to do that. And I don't think I'll perish in the attempt, but what a way to go.
Well, I'll play the Marlin Perkins role again if necessary.
You can throw the rope, but I'm going to do that. And then, so that will be sort of a capstone of the river aspects of this journey. And then when I get onto the Clearwater, I'm hoping to rent a kayak for a day, half a day, or where the Snake and the Columbia meet, somewhere in there. And then finally an excursion boat at Astoria at the mouth of the Pacific. I was hoping to canoe the Marias this summer. That's not possible, but I was at the fight site, and so I'll save that for another year.
All right, Clay. Well, we're out of time. Hopefully, in about 10 days, we will have survived the Missouri River and another Wendover hike, and maybe we can get back together and look back at this trip.
See what happens. So this, every year when I do the Wendover Death March, I say never again. But of course, I'm going to do it again. I'm a little worried. But the river part never gets old. I mean, all you have to do is get yourself into that canoe. There are a couple of voluntary hikes that no one has to take. Going down on the second day on the Missouri River when it's 89 or 90 degrees, the water is perfect temperature, and maybe a thunderstorm is starting to gather in the west, and it's summertime and the living is easy. It's just like almost a magical experience to float the river with as little human noise as possible. So I can't wait for that. We'll report back at the other end of this. Anything can happen.
So far, no fires that are impacting us, but you never know. As we've learned in recent years, the winds. Wayne, our outfitter, had to postpone a trip for 24 hours last week just because of incredible rainfall here. So you never know.
You and I seldom disagree, but when I tell the group, don't worry, the river will take you there, and you're like, no, the wind will make you go backward. And you always go a little viral whenever I make the claim that the river does most of the work.
All right, well, we will see how it goes this year, and we'll be back in maybe a couple weeks to talk about it. This has been another edition of Listening to America, and we'll see you next week.
Farewell, everyone.